Johnny Carson was still smiling when he said it. "That guitar looks like it owes somebody money." The audience laughed. Of course they laughed. It was The Tonight Show. It was Johnny, and the line was good. Carson leaned forward with that mischievous glint that every regular viewer knew meant he was about to push a little harder, have a little more fun. He gestured toward the battered acoustic resting across Johnny Cash's knee and said, loud enough for the whole studio to hear, "Come on, I dare you, right now. I walk the line. Let's see what a worthless guitar can actually do." The laughter continued for a moment. Then it didn't. Because Johnny Cash didn't laugh. He didn't deflect. He didn't reach for a joke to smooth the moment over the way guests usually did when Carson got playful. He looked down at the guitar in his hands, slowly, the way a man looks at something when someone who doesn't understand its value has just spoken carelessly about it. Then he looked up at Carson, and his voice came out quiet and level and absolutely final. "You don't know what this guitar is." For a moment, no one moved. The laughter had drained out of the room so quickly that the silence felt pressurized, like something had changed in the air itself. Carson's smile stayed on his face, but his eyes had shifted, recalibrating, reading the room, reading Cash, trying to understand what had just happened and why a harmless joke had suddenly cost him something he hadn't meant to spend. But that moment didn't start there. It started decades earlier, in a farmhouse in Arkansas, beside a boy who never got to grow old, and a guitar that had been carrying his name ever since. If you've ever held on to something broken because it was the only piece of someone you had left, stay with this. Because that's exactly what Johnny Carson just asked Johnny Cash to make into a punchline. And what Cash did next, what he said, what he played, and what he finally admitted on national television about why he never went anywhere without that ruined guitar, changed everyone in that studio, and it's been kept quiet for far too long. The moment that silenced the Tonight Show studio didn't arrive without a history. It arrived because two men carried very different kinds of weight into the same room, and neither of them had been warned about the others. By the late 1970s, Johnny Carson had built The Tonight Show into the most powerful platform in American television. Not the loudest, not the most dramatic, the most trusted. 30 million people watched it at night from their living rooms, and what Carson did better than anyone else who had ever sat behind that desk was this. He made famous people human. He had a gift for ease, for the perfectly placed joke, for the kind of relaxed warmth that made guests lower their guard without ever realizing it was happening. Presidents, astronauts, actors, musicians, they all came through that chair, and most of them said more than they planned to. Carson had a way of making honesty feel safe, right up until the moment it arrived. Johnny Cash arrived that night carrying something Carson hadn't been briefed on. At this point in his life, Cash was a monument, the man in black, a figure who had survived addiction, arrest, personal destruction, and public collapse, and had come out the other side with his voice intact and his reputation rebuilt into something almost mythological. He had earned his legend the way very few people earn anything, by losing everything first and then choosing, deliberately and at great cost, to become someone worth remembering. He walked into rooms and the air changed, not because of ego, because of weight, and the guitar he carried was part of that weight. It was not a beautiful instrument. It had never been a beautiful instrument. The body was cracked along the lower bout, repaired years ago with a strip of darker wood that never matched the original finish and was never meant to. The neck was worn smooth in a pattern that recorded exactly how Cash held it, where his left hand had rested for 30 years. The strap was handmade leather, broken on one side and knotted back together with a knot that had never been retied. 3 of the 6 tuning pegs were replacements, mismatched, functional, installed without any concern for appearance. The face of the guitar carried a series of deep gouges that didn't look like road damage or stage wear. They looked deliberate, like marks left by a single event, not accumulated over time. Every musician on Cash's touring crew knew the unspoken rule about that guitar. You did not touch it. You did not move it. You did not ask about it. Carson didn't know the rule. And in about 4 minutes, He was going to find out exactly why it existed. The guitar did not belong to Johnny Cash, not originally, not in the way that mattered. It had belonged to Jack Cash, Johnny's older brother, a boy who died at 14 years old in the spring of 1944, and who had been gone for more than 3 decades by the night Carson made his joke. Gone so long that most of the world had never heard his name. Gone so long that even people close to Cash had learned not to bring him up. But not gone in any way that the people who knew Cash well would ever describe as finished. Jack Cash had never left. He had simply moved into the things his brother kept. Jack was 2 years older than Johnny, and in the Cash household, he was the one who carried the family's hope like it was a physical object. Not Johnny, Jack. Their mother said it openly. Their neighbors said it. Jack was the one who was going to be a minister, who talked about scripture with a conviction that made grown men stop mid-sentence and listen. He was serious and gentle and certain in the way that 14-year-olds almost never are, like he'd arrived in the world already knowing what he was for. Johnny idolized him completely. On May 12, 1944, Jack was working at a lumber mill outside their home in Dyess, Arkansas, cutting fence posts to earn money for the family. The table saw caught him. The details of what followed belong to the category of things that get described once and then put away. Too specific, too brutal, too final to repeat in full. Jack held on for 8 days. Cash's mother said he died peaceful, said he talked about angels and rivers of light in the hours before the end. Cash was 12 years old. He stood at the edge of something that morning that he would spend the rest of his life circling without ever quite leaving. The guitar had been Jack's, a cheap mail-order acoustic the Cash family had bought secondhand. Nothing remarkable, nothing that would have caught anyone's eye in a music store. Jack had barely begun to learn it when he died. But Johnny took it when he left home, took it into the Air Force, took it to Memphis, carried it through the door at Sun Records in 1956 when he walked in with nothing but nerve and a handful of songs that hadn't existed the year before. One of those songs was I Walk the Line, a vow Cash wrote to himself, a promise to be the man Jack believed he was going to become. And the first time he ever recorded it, he played it on his dead brother's guitar. Carson had just dared him to play it again, and Cash picked up that guitar, and the whole studio went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with entertainment anymore. Cash stood up slowly. He didn't look at Carson. He carried the guitar to the center of the stage, the way you carry something that belongs to a specific place, and he settled onto the stool that had been set there. And for a long moment, he simply held the instrument against his body without touching the strings, like he was reminding it where it was, like he was reminding himself. Then he began to tune it. This part took longer than anyone expected. The mismatched pegs responded differently than the originals, looser, slightly unpredictable, and Cash compensated for each one without thinking. The muscle memory of 30 years, making the adjustments before his conscious mind had finished forming them. He plucked each string individually, listened, turned the peg by fractions, listened again. The studio was quiet enough that the sound of each individual string carried to the back row. Nobody spoke. Nobody shifted in their seat. The crew members who had been moving between camera positions had stopped where they were and stayed there. Carson sat behind his desk with his hands folded and said nothing. When Cash finally settled the tuning and brought his right hand across the strings for the first chord of I Walk the Line, something happened in that room that the people present would spend years trying to describe accurately. The guitar did not sound broken. It did not sound like a music past its usefulness. It sounded the way very old things sometimes sound when they have been loved consistently for a long time, deepened, settled into itself, carrying a resonance that newer instruments simply do not have, because resonance of that kind cannot be built. It has to be lived into, year by year, hour by hour, song by song. The opening chord filled the studio, and the audience recognized it before Cash had played 3 notes. He did not perform it. There is a difference between performing a song and playing one, and Cash understood that difference better than almost anyone in American music. Performing is outward, shape for the room, conscious of the camera, aware of effect. What Cash did on that stool was something else entirely. His eyes settled on the middle distance. His voice stayed low and direct, and completely undecorated. Every word of "I Walk the Line" arrived as though he was saying it for the first time to the only person it was ever written for. I keep a close watch on this heart of mine. Halfway through, Cash stopped. Not because something had gone wrong. He stopped, looked down at the guitar in his hands, and took one slow breath that the microphone caught completely. The silence lasted 5 seconds, maybe 10. The audience did not move. Carson did not move. And then Cash made a decision. Visible, deliberate, chosen, and he went on. He played the final chord and held it until the last of the sound had left the room on its own terms. Then he lifted his hands from the strings and sat still. The applause, when it finally came, was the slow kind. The kind that starts before people have decided to start it, because their hands have already moved without them. Cash looked down at the guitar, not at Carson, not at the audience, at the guitar. And he said quietly, to no one in particular, and to one person specifically, "My brother Jack owned this. He never really got to learn to play it." The studio held the silence like it was something fragile. Then Carson leaned forward, not the smooth, practiced lean of a host managing a segment, but the lean of a man who needed to be closer to what he'd just heard, and asked the only question left in the room. Why did you keep it? Not why did you play it? Not what does it mean to you? Why did you keep it all these years when it was held together with knots and repairs and nothing else? When every professional around you had access to instruments that actually worked? Why carry something this broken, this far? Cash turned the guitar over slowly in his hands and thought about the answer long enough that you understood he wasn't finding it. He was deciding how much of it to give away. Then he said, because a perfect guitar would make "I Walk the Line" a perfect song. A song about a man who kept his promises, clean and easy and finished, but played on Jack's guitar, with every crack and every repair and every mile it had traveled in the 30 years since a 14-year-old boy left it behind. It sounded the way keeping a promise actually felt. Not clean, not easy, true. He paused. His jaw tightened in a way that people who had watched his films recognized. The expression of a man holding something back that was going to come out anyway. Then he admitted something he had almost never said in public. That, for years, he hadn't kept the promise. The pills, the chaos, the years where he was everything that song said not to be. He had carried the guitar through all of it. Never sold it. Never left it in a hotel room. Never let it out of his possession, even when he was at the bottom of everything, and selling it would have been the practical thing to do. He carried it because Jack never got to grow up and become someone who broke his promises. Cash had to carry both lives, his own and the one his brother never got to finish. The crew members who were there said the room changed again at that, differently than it had changed during the performance. Quieter, more personal. Like everyone in that studio had suddenly been handed something they hadn't expected to be trusted with. Carson said nothing for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost every trace of the Tonight Show host. What was left was just a man, sitting across from another man, understanding exactly what it costs to carry something that heavy for that long. But what no one in that studio knew, what Cash himself had never told anyone, was that he had almost left that guitar at the hotel that night. And the reason he changed his mind had nothing to do with Carson's dare. Cash had been alone in his hotel room that morning when he made the decision. He had taken the guitar out of its case the way he did every year around this time. Not for practice, not for performance, not for anyone but himself and the silence of whatever room he happened to be in. He played "I Walk the Line" once, slowly. The way you say a prayer you've said so many times, the words have worn smooth. Then he sat with the guitar in his lap and didn't play anything at all for a while, because it was May. And in May, Jack was always close. The Tonight Show appearance had been booked months earlier. When the date landed where it did, near the anniversary of May 12th, 1944, The morning Cash's world had split into before and after. He had considered calling the show and rescheduling. He had done it before. Most years he kept this time private, kept the guitar close, kept the ritual between himself and a brother who had been gone for more than 3 decades. But that morning, something shifted. He thought about Jack's guitar sitting in its case in a hotel room while he sat across from Johnny Carson with a borrowed instrument, playing songs for 30 million people. And he understood that the most honest thing he could do, for the music, for the promise, for the boy who never got to grow old, was to bring it. Carson's dare hadn't been a violation. It had been, accidentally and improbably, an invitation. He had given Jack Cash's guitar a room full of people to finally play for. What Cash said in a later interview about that night, about what it meant and what he decided to do with the guitar after, is the part of this story that has never fully been told. In a years after that Tonight Show night, Cash was asked whether he ever considered having the guitar properly restored. New finish, matched tuning pegs, the cracks filled, and the body refinished until it looked the way it might have looked if none of those decades had happened to it. He said no, without hesitation. He said, "The damage is the history. You restore it, you're saying the history didn't matter. I'm not willing to say that." He played that guitar until his hands made it difficult to play anything at all. In his final years, when his health had taken most of what the road hadn't already claimed, people close to him said they would sometimes hear it from the next room. The same melody, the same pace, the same song. Always I walk the line, always once, always slowly. A man honoring a promise to a boy who had been gone for 60 years and had never once stopped being present. Cash directed that the guitar not be put in a museum, not be displayed, not be preserved behind glass somewhere for strangers to read a placard about. He wanted it kept the way Jack had left it, unfinished, still becoming something. Some things aren't worth fixing. They're worth carrying. If this story reached something in you, something you've kept that nobody else quite understands, subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Tell us in the comments, what broken thing are you still carrying?